We're going to get started here. We're going to start with the panel introducing themselves. These three individuals, they've never met one another before, but they are going to engage in a discussion together surrounding all sorts of questions and issues around refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. So without further ado, we'll let them introduce themselves. It'll go over to Dr. Graham, who will introduce himself, and then he will lead off the conversation with the first question tonight.
Good evening. My name is Mike Clark, and I'm a humanitarian affairs professional. I've worked in over 70 war and disaster zones around the world. I lived in the Middle East, worked in all the different refugee camps in the Middle East since 2011, and started about in 2004 working in wars and disasters. I'm with Global Aid Pro. We're a small consulting company. We work with governments, humanitarian organizations, and businesses in the humanitarian domain, just trying to support them. I'm a subject matter expert in humanitarian diplomacy. That's my doctoral research that I conducted. And in that, I spent a lot of time negotiating with armed groups, terrorist organizations, governments, as well as humanitarian organizations and different civil society leaders, how we can develop humanitarian responses on the ground. How can our drivers arrive safely in a village to bring aid in? So just kind of more of the nuts and bolts of actually moving and mobilizing humanitarian aid. I'm based in Germany. I'm German-American. And from there, I kind of hop around the world, and it's a privilege to be with you, and really delighted to see the great turnout. I'm looking forward to a great evening.
Buenas noches, good evening everyone. My name is Joanna Maravilla and I work for the Office of Language and Cultural Education as a refugee and immigrant student advocate. Prior to having the opportunity to work within the Chicago public school system, I have been working for the past 6 years with pre-service and in-service teachers that work with our emergent bilingual student population, not only here in CPS but also in other school districts, as I am also completing my doctorate in education, really looking at how can teachers and administrators really think about how to use students' experiential knowledge as well as students' multilingualisms to really develop lessons, curriculum, but also cohesiveness when really thinking deeper about what it means to be a refugee and immigrant student within the school system.
Hi, my name is James Porter, and I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator at Refugee One. Refugee One is one of the 5 resettlement agencies located here in Chicago. So we resettle refugees from all over the world. We've been doing refugee resettlement since 1982, and since then have resettled more than 18,000 refugees. I've been with Refugee One for about 3 years and have been involved with refugee resettlement for about the last 9 or 10. And yeah, I think I'll pass it off at that.
Good evening, everyone. First and foremost, I want to thank Pastor Jeremy and Uptown Church for inviting Uplift High School to be a part of tonight's event. For us, this is actually something that's quite personal. As a school, we serve quite a few different immigrant groups within our building, both from different parts of the world and also students with different immigration statuses. So this is not only educational for us as administrators, my assistant principal, Jennifer White, is in the back of the room as well, but it's also really important that we build this cohesive community that can really support our kids, right, on their journey, right, as they go through this pathway, regardless of whatever their immigration status is. Tonight we're really focusing on the refugee crisis, but we have students that are a part of different immigrant groups as well. And that'll lead me into my first question, right? So refugees are only one immigrant group that are a part of the fabric of our society right now. Can someone on the panel really talk to us and tell us about what the difference is between asylum seekers, refugees, and migrant groups?
Sure, I can give it a stab. So at Refugee One, we help people who have come through the formal U.S. refugee admissions program. So those are folks that have been granted refugee status through UNHCR. The real difference between a refugee, somebody who comes through the refugee admissions program, and an asylum seeker is the point from which they apply for asylum or for refuge. So for refugees, in order to be granted refugee status, you have to have crossed an international border or left your home country because of persecution or violence, and you can't return due to a well-founded fear that that persecution will be ongoing. Whereas asylum seekers present themselves at the border and make their case for asylum either at the border or from within the country. So that's the distinction I would draw between asylum seekers and refugees.
I think you'll notice, and maybe when you watch the news, often the term migrant, immigrant, refugee will kind of used interchangeably. And although the international law is pretty clear in making some distinctions between a refugee and a migrant, and the black and white, especially when you're dealing with applications, it can kind of bleed over and blend over. So I think often, we don't have to, it's good to try to clear the distinction at the same time. There are a lot of case-by-case situations as well. In every country, like the U.S., will have a different definition how they will view a refugee and who can be a refugee and an asylum seeker as well.
And so I'd like to add, in conversation with one of my students previously that actually is now a teacher within the Chicago public school system but identified as refugee several years ago, she said to me, I could never go back to my country. I don't have a choice. I would love to go back home so that I can come back and make this my home. And so really with thinking about that is that as a refugee, you never have the opportunity to go back to your native country.
Mike, I'll start with you on this question because you've been overseas and you've worked in the refugee camps. How would you describe life in a refugee camp in the Middle East right now?
Okay. So the single largest driver of mass displacement in the world with over 6 million refugees is the conflict in Syria. Maybe I'll just back up. Often people ask me, well, what's actually going on there? In 2011, there was a movement to try to topple Bashar al-Assad's regime. It has failed. You have massive conflict ongoing with Bashar Assad hanging on to power. He's backed by his militia as well as Hezbollah. And for example, Russian troops, and then you have the other on the side, the opposition. So you have a lot of different armed groups violating international humanitarian law. And we just have to say all parties to conflict, armed actors in Syria, have violated consistently international humanitarian law. What we've seen really since World War II, the biggest shift is that civilians are no longer just collateral damage. Back in World War II, you would hear of accidentally or, often people would be killed even before World War II by accident. But now civilians have become targets. And that is probably the biggest shift we're seeing is that hospitals and schools are fair game. Neighborhoods are fair game. Disproportionate use of weapons and using illegal weapons has really caused a mass exodus. They're displaced people internally, but people are really leaving with nothing on their backs. Rape and sexual violence have become really weapons of war. And so you have people who have barely made it. I meet children in refugee camps who have witnessed their entire families slaughtered, executed in the most barbaric way. They often arrive, let's say, in Lebanon, across the border where they'll be registered. It's not as easy as it perhaps seems, because even refugees, for example, in Lebanon, have to pay the Lebanese government now a residency fee. And they are living in camps. There are camp cities. Sometimes there are tents. Sometimes they're kind of like wooden huts. They're provided at times some heating. Sometimes they're provided blankets and clothing. The winter months are extremely cruel. There are snowstorms in the desert. And even, people are arriving with flip-flops and T-shirts and whatever they have. If it's 40 degrees, it can be very dangerous. A lot of health issues. It's not sanitary. Threats to girls in camps is always a major risk. People are having to make impossible decisions. They're traumatized. They're hungry. And for many, arriving in Lebanon is just the first step of even a more dangerous journey ahead.
All right, thank you. So in America, we often only get as much information as our media provides to us, and oftentimes it's what makes the most money. And oftentimes we hear about Syria and the refugee crisis that exists from that situation. What are some other issues occurring around the world that has caused a lot of refugee groups to try to migrate to other countries?
So I can talk a little bit about some of the groups that we're working with currently, some of the main kind of demographics that we see entering the country as refugees right now. It kind of changes every year just based on conflicts throughout the world and what the State Department sets in terms of quotas from each region of the world. A couple of years ago, Syrians were really the largest demographic that we were working with, being one of the largest, humanitarian crises that we're facing right now. Again, against the backdrop that he was just describing, we were resettling the largest number of Syrian refugees out of all the refugees that we work with. But in the last 2 years, that's really flipped on its head. And today, Syrians are one of the smallest demographics that we're working with, in spite of the conflict being ongoing. Today, we're continuing to see a lot of refugees come from Burma, specifically Rohingya refugees. Last year, more than 750,000 Rohingya refugees were forced from the country and have sought refuge in several different places, but we've seen a large number of Rohingya coming to the U.S. for the last several years. And this year in particular, we've seen kind of an increase in some other smaller demographics, including European refugees. We've seen a spike in those coming from the Ukraine and Moldova. But I'd say the largest groups that we're working with right now are still the Rohingya and Congolese refugees.
Osei, would you say what was just shared with us is a similar population that you work with at the moment?
Yes, so as of the end of last academic school year, we had over 1,700 students that identified as refugee and that have migrated. Let me get to my statistics here. Of which, as indicated, Burma was the highest population, Iraq, Syria, and Malaysia, actually, for our student population here in Chicago.
Another phenomenon, perhaps is not mentioned in the U.S. news, is that about 20 million people are now considered climate-based refugees, environmental refugees. So climate change is affecting, and a lot of people are displaced from their homes because of climate-based events, disasters, and they will no longer be able to return to their homes because their homes have been destroyed. So that is actually a growing, emerging population that, of course, has not received legal recognition. Therefore, they will probably not be able to be resettled or accepted in the United States because international law would kind of limit that status. But I think in my child's lifetime, climate-based refugees will be a growing population as well.
I think one thing I would add is just to kind of give some scope of the size of the refugee crisis that we're facing right now. Between all of these conflicts, some of those which we've described and some that we haven't, there are more than 68.5 million displaced people throughout the world today. It's the largest levels of displacements really on record, and of those, about 23.5 have received refugee status, so they can qualify for refugee resettlement. Although very few refugees who have refugee status actually end up being resettled.
What's it like now in the U.S. compared to, like, let's say in the last 6 to 8 years, especially with America having a different presidential leader 6 to 8 years ago? So what was it like then versus what it's like now? What's the trends that are happening? What are we seeing? And how are we comparing to, say, Germany, where you're at, Mike, and other countries that have more of an open door policy when it comes to refugees? That's a long question, so sorry.
Next question.
So I can, go ahead.
I can start maybe with the abroad, because I really have no clue what's going on in the States.
And I can talk about what's happening here a little bit, yeah.
I was living in the Middle East when the Arab Spring began. So this was Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria. And even back then in 2011, we noticed that the United States administration, for whatever reason, was really hesitant to back democratic reform. And obviously, you can't always be so critical of it, because although democratic reform sounds really good, you always have to wonder if you topple a strong dictator, who will fill that vacuum. And we have seen that with Gaddafi, who was toppled in Libya. I happened to be there when it all happened. Who will fill that vacuum? It is often well-prepared militant groups. So what we've noticed, the U.S. administration, of course, was publicly perhaps not making very consistent statements, but we can never forget that the United States is still the single largest donor in humanitarian aid assistance. So the United States government funds possibly 50% of the United Nations. Food aid is well over 50%. So even in South Sudan, the United States government is providing voluntary humanitarian organizations with hundreds of millions of dollars of support. It sounds like a lot of money. In fact, U.S. aid, U.S. government assistance in these situations is probably just 1.2% of the entire federal budget. However, it is significant. And so I think we don't want to, I mean, we can always be critical of what's happening in terms of politics and policy, but in terms of aid assistance, which could be food aid, education assistance, we're still doing at least something. And that does make a huge difference. And millions of people depend on the U.S. government's support.
And so I guess what I would like to kind of add to that, and really thinking about, can the U.S. be doing better? Yes, perhaps we are doing something compared to other countries. I think about what came out on the news just recently, where there were thousands of mothers and children that were tear gassed at the border of Tijuana. And what does that mean, right? What does it mean over the summer where we had children that were locked up at the border and were separated from their parents and at this time are still waiting to, go through the process of, right? So in that essence, can we be doing better?
Yeah, I think the answer, is definitely yes. We've seen across the board, and I mean that in all seriousness. I think that across the board, really, the current administration has been making strides in dismantling the programs and the opportunities that are set up to support refugees and immigrants. I can talk a little bit about, kind of how the U.S. response has changed over the past several years under this administration. During the last year of President Obama's administration, the refugee cap, or the cap on refugee admissions, was set at 110,000, and they came fairly close to meeting that. They resettled about 85,000 refugees that year. Take that in comparison to this past year, the U.S. only welcomed 22,000 refugees. Globally, only 102,000 refugees were resettled this year. So 2 years ago, the U.S. resettled 85,000 alone, and just this year, globally, only 102,000 were resettled. So you can see that the U.S. is, by scaling back the number of refugees that we're accepting, it's really, it's kind of has a disproportionate effect on refugee resettlement, because the U.S. has always been a leader in global refugee resettlement until recently. The Trump administration reduced that ceiling for refugee admissions from 110,000 in 2016 down to really the lowest in U.S. history last year was 45,000. That was what the ceiling was set at. And they lowered that even further for this coming year to just 30,000. So, there's a real concern that if they continue to lower the ceilings, but they also don't meet those ceilings, that pretty soon the refugee program will be dismantled completely. And we believe that there's a powerful few people in Washington that are making sure that that happens. So it's our goal to make sure that the infrastructure that is in place to support refugees and immigrants can be sustained over the next several years, because there's always been ebbs and flows to immigration levels and quotas in the United States. But I think that it's important that we maintain the infrastructure that's in place to support refugees and immigrants, so that when refugee resettlement resumes at a normal rate, and we're hopeful that it will, under a different administration, that we'll still be there able to continue doing the work that we've done in the past.
Perhaps to add to that point too, and this is, I think, it's so eye-opening. And I'm an outsider who doesn't deal with the day-to-day nuts and bolts in the U.S., but on the outside, when the U.S. reduces its ceiling of who they accept, it plays into the hands of despots, it plays into the hands of dictators, because it is not to your advantage if you're a dictator to see some of your country people safely resettled in the United States, where free speech exists, where they can organize, where they can start funding opposition to free possibly their country. So again, everything in this is taking place in a system. And so a decision to reduce refugee numbers in the United States can have right away a negative effect, not only just killing hope of desperate families, but actually empower and enable dictators to continue their horrible policy of slaughtering their own people.
I think that's one thing a lot of people don't recognize or maybe understand is that refugee resettlement, in addition to being a humanitarian program, and that's what it is at its core, is it's humanitarian in nature, but it's also a powerful foreign policy tool. And I think that the current administration is not using that to their advantage. That's something that we've used historically to our advantage, and today are not.
I think maybe we want to switch, because I live in Germany too. 2015, over 1 million refugees crossed into Germany, and Germany has a history of accepting refugees. But I mean, I think about it now that I think 75% of Germans are still supporting that policy move 3 years later. I mean, that's a politician's dream, right? That you make a decision, and 3 years later, 75% of the population agrees it was good. But we've seen how, Germany had, I think, 1.2 million jobs it couldn't fill. And this year alone, 300,000 refugees found employment. I mean, the benefit to the economy, the infusement of just diversity, people learning. It's been 3 years now. We have now competent German speakers who are Syrians. I mean, one of my friends is a dentist from Syria. While he's still not able to practice as a physician, he is now a dental hygienist, and he's just happy his 5 daughters and his wife are safe. They are now paying taxes. So I think, again, it is really also punishing the country, in this case the United States, can be punished, because there's this myth that refugees are just people who are poor and uneducated. And when you actually meet refugees, they're highly educated. One of the reasons why they are targeted is because they are a threat to regimes. We're meeting a lot of upper middle class people, and of course by the time they arrive in Europe, they are broke because people smugglers have taken advantage of them. But they're entrepreneurs. They have their own businesses, and they will want to start new businesses. And I think living in Germany, you see kind of the positive effects of even my daughter having some kids from Syria in her preschool. It's an amazing way to also expose people to a way of life. And I think it's just a sad thing that we're missing out here now.
All right, so I have a 2-part question, and I'll be a little bit easier on the panel than Pastor Jeremy over here. So my first question will actually be to the audience. So if you could raise your hand if you are an immigrant. Okay. So quite a bit more than I thought would be in the audience. So the panel, you saw how many hands went up. What'd you say? I'm sorry? Yes, we are. But you saw how many hands went up, right? So first-generation immigrants to America at the moment. My question to the panel is, knowing that the majority of us are non-immigrants, non-first-generation immigrants, what can we do to support individuals who are resettling to America now? How can we be allies in making sure that they are comfortable and making sure that they're accepted into the greater society?
You want to start with that one?
Sure, I can start. I mean, first and foremost, we're all human beings, right? And as my abuelita used to tell me, treat others the way that you want to be treated, right? And so, therefore, how can we be inviting to individuals that have arrived to this country in various forms, but at the same time, how can we be understanding of their situation, right? And so really thinking about that from an educational perspective is how then do we help facilitate additional opportunities and resources to immerse our students and assuring that not only are they able to acclimate into this new environment, right? Because not only are they acclimating into this new society, right? But also educational system as well. But also, how do we encourage them to use their assets, right, their experiential knowledge to educate us as well?
Just kind of as a practical matter, a couple other things that I would say folks can do. Well, first, I think, like Joanna said, just creating a culture of welcome is something that each of us can do. Making sure that whenever we're out and about, that you smile at your neighbors, that people walking past you on the streets, because really it's just forming, everyday relationships with people that gives you the opportunity to make a difference in their lives. Kind of practically, things that you can do here in Chicago. There's lots of different ways to get involved with refugees. There's 5 different refugee resettlement agencies like Refugee One in the city, and you can volunteer with them as a mentor or as a tutor. I think academic support is one of the greatest needs. Refugee youth are incredibly resilient and have tremendous potential. There have been studies done, actually a study was done by the National Bureau of Economic Research at the University of Notre Dame last year or 2 years ago that was looking at the social and economic impact of refugee resettlement. And its findings were really similar to what we just talked about, that refugees are an economic that there's an economic incentive to refugee resettlement. Another thing that this study found was that refugee youth typically do better than their American-born counterparts in school when they're given the appropriate supports. Just like, refugees often form businesses at higher rates than their American-born counterparts. So I think tutoring, being a tutor to a refugee youth or to an adult who's trying to learn English, being a mentor, just showing them how to get around the city or do grocery shopping, little everyday tasks that are new to them completely. And then I think the biggest way that I would encourage folks to get involved right now is advocacy. I think that's more important than ever right now because we see, like I said, this administration making strides at really dismantling this program and taking apart the supports that are in place to help refugees and immigrants. And so I think by contacting our legislators, reaching out to our elected representatives and telling them that this is something that's important to us, that's a really, really good way to make a difference. And living here in Chicago, you might say, well, my representatives are already friendly to refugees, right? Maybe your representative is Jan Schakowsky, who's a champion for refugees. Go Jan. But that doesn't mean it's not important to call her office because legislators have to create priorities. They have legislative priorities and they base those on what their constituents are saying. So if you continue to call their offices, even if they're already supportive, that means that these issues will raise to the top of their legislative priorities and will be able to make a difference.
No, and just to kind of add in regards to what we're seeking, or at least what my department is seeking, is we're always looking for volunteers as well, especially those of you that are multilingual, to help facilitate one-on-one tutoring with our students. So if you are interested, feel free to see me after.
I think a lot of the criticism, or I would say probably more ignorant criticism often is, well, these people are not integrating. And I would always argue integration requires hospitality. It's probably the first step, and I think what's really important is that integration is not a system. It's not an education program. Integration is really community and it's really life, and that's why I think the role of educators, of a school system, the role of even a church or a mosque, a community center. If it's a YMCA, finding ways to really create a culture of hospitality. The people that I would say have really positive views of refugees are those who have actually invited refugees into their home. And you'll notice, and I've seen this over and over again, refugees, once you become friends, they will also be welcoming you into your home. And it's a great way to expose your children to a whole different way of life, some great cooking. And I think to me, often integration is something we always want to outsource, and then we wonder why it doesn't work. I think the community, civil society needs to own integration, and it begins with hospitality.
Something really interesting about the way refugee resettlement works in the United States is it's actually kind of a shining example of a functioning private-public partnership, in that about 50% of the funds for refugee resettlement agencies come from the federal government. But the rest of the funds that are required to do this work come from people like you, from donors, from corporations sometimes, or from private foundations. And so it's really a functioning partnership, and it takes both sides, the public side and the private side. Refugee resettlement is possible because communities of faith have been partnering with refugee resettlement agencies for decades to welcome families. Welcoming families requires an immense amount of resources and time and talent, and that's something that a refugee resettlement agency can't do on their own. And so they really rely on the partnerships with local businesses who employ refugees, local schools who support refugees in their academic endeavors, et cetera.
If I could ask a follow-up question to Jim's and Joanna, what supports exist for kids educationally that come to the U.S. as refugees right now?
Sure. Well, I can definitely speak to the supports that are being offered by the Chicago Public School System through our office. And so really there's been a support program for over 10 years now, and most recently our department has received more funding to really give academic support to our students, right? So as a refugee and immigrant student advocate, really my intent is not only to help develop short-term goals, but also long-term academic support systems that are sustainable, not only in the elementary school system, but also high school and then post-secondary as well, right? So how are we thinking about our students that are multilingual, right? So how do we use that? But in addition to that, facilitate tutoring, preparation for mathematics, and then prepare them to go into high school, and then thereon after. How is the Chicago Public School System then partnering up with community universities as well as community colleges to make sure that students have access to opportunities, not just a four-year university, but also students that maybe are seeking other resources like getting a certification and completing a trade, etc. So I don't know if that answers your question-ish.
It does. James, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I would just add that, so for refugee youth, they face a lot of challenges, and immigrant youth when they arrive here in the United States. Oftentimes they have very little educational background or very few linguistic skills when it comes to English, even though they might speak 4 or 5 other languages aside from English. But I think that what we try to do at Refugee One, we have about 500 kids that we support through our youth program. And we try to make sure that every one of them is matched with an individual academic tutor who can meet with them weekly for at least an hour and really help coach them through some of the changes and the process of integrating. It's challenging to be a refugee or an immigrant in Chicago as a child because you're placed in your grade level not based on your educational or linguistic background, but based on your age. So if you're a 16-year-old, you go into a sophomore, whatever that is. It has nothing to do with how much schooling you've had in the past or what your language skills are. And so they have a lot of challenges to overcome, but it's really incredible how quickly they're able to do that.
Mm-hmm. May I add something to that? I also wanted to add that in addition to providing academic support services, we also have a team of individuals that are social workers that are also providing restorative justice support services to our students, right? Really thinking about trauma. I think that that's something that we haven't really discussed in the panel, but really how has refugeeing from another country, what is that trauma, right? And how does that trauma look like for children, but also for families as well as they acclimate, and then how then do we work to provide that cognitive support in addition to making sure that their mental health is also adequate, right? Because we have to be mentally, how do I want to say this? Socially and emotionally okay in order to be academically successful, right? So it's reciprocating. So then how then do we provide that for our students?
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to have Andrea ask a couple of questions from the audience so our time doesn't run out. But in light of the things that you're saying, I love hearing this idea of like culture of welcome, culture of hospitality. Can you, get on your soapbox for a minute, whatever your soapboxes are, and just sort of like encourage us? Like fear is a big motivator that keeps people apart. What is it that's driving us apart? What's keeping us from this culture of welcome and hospitality? Can you bust through some of the myths and the narratives? I can think of one right now, and we're hearing from our top government officer that we don't want refugees coming into the country because they're all criminals and terrorists. And that's a myth. That's fear. It's fear-mongering. And it's keeping us apart from one another. What would you encourage us with to say, what are the myths that we need to bust through? What is the truth we need to see? And then how can that help us generate that culture of welcome?
So I think there are several myths, and that's a really good one that you brought up, that refugees that there's a risk of bringing terror to our shores by doing refugee resettlement. And I think that to make that claim is really to deny history, because if you look at the past 35 years, the U.S. has been successfully vetting refugees without ever once having an act of terror committed on U.S. soil by a refugee. And so it's an incredibly safe program. The vetting is extensive, and it's done by multiple security agencies in the U.S. government, apart from what UNHCR does overseas. And so we see that this is actually a very, very safe program. I think another myth that we hear often is one that we've touched on tonight, is that refugees are a drain on the economy. But the reality behind that is that refugees, there's actually an economic incentive to refugee resettlement. So I don't know if that's an answer to your questions necessarily, but I'd say if I was going to get on my soapbox, I think I would say the one thing preventing people from really having a community and a culture of welcome is just kind of complacency. I think a lot of times we know about these issues, we hear about them in the news, but we don't quite investigate them, or we don't take the time to pick up the phone and call our legislators and see if there's something that we can do to make a difference. And so again, I would encourage you to engage in advocacy. Find ways that you can be supportive of refugees and immigrants systematically, and that you can make things, that you can really make a difference, and you can make these issues, really raise to the top of the priorities of our elected representatives.
Yeah. And so I guess my soapbox would be listen. Take the time to listen to people's stories, right? Because we all have stories. We all have a history. And so listen.
My soapbox is probably the closest to you that refugees are not terrorists, they're fleeing terror. When you hear the stories of survival and the trauma of refugee children, it is unspeakable horror. These are people who have experienced crazy religious ideas, and they want nothing, they dream of nothing greater than being in a secular country where they can perhaps process what faith means or what it doesn't mean to them. They don't want to be told what to believe. So I think that's something to consider. And for me, it's just, I continue to look at, how do we address root problems? And I'm always amazed when I'm in disasters and wars. I'm often standing, if it's Fox News or CNN, I don't care. I stand next to them, and the cameramen and women are looking through the same lens that I am, and they're interpreting something completely different. And I think to me it's just so shocking how people are taking great liberties in interpreting what's actually happening on the ground. And so I would urge caution. I mean, you're inquisitive because you're here. And I would say that probably doesn't represent maybe a great percentage of people, because I think often, I'm myself too, I'd rather just turn on the news and figure out what's going on and move on with it. But continue to be inquisitive, continue to ask questions, continue to challenge the culture of just accepting the loudest voice, who yells the loudest. And I think that's what can really help us to create more of an open-minded culture.